We have Reverend Linda Hamill with us tonight, and we're very happy to have Linda with us. She served as a minister in the Redlands at the Trinity Wellington Point Uniting Church, and we met through the Ministers Fellowship in the Redlands, and she has been involved in a variety of different ministries and been involved in disaster recovery ministry in Australia since 2008. And she's helped the Redlands Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy train that and help that program really get started here in the Redlands. Linda worked as a disaster recovery project officer for the Uniting Church. She is committed to preaching and actively building church community relations. Linda has just started pastoring at a brand new church in Toowoomba, the Uniting Church there. Last Sunday was her first Sunday, and she's also in a doctoral program in the U.S., so we really appreciate her taking the time to come out and share with us this evening. Let's give her a hand.
Hi, I have two goals for tonight. I desire to give you tools and information that I found useful in wrestling with God regarding natural disasters or disasters, full stop, and so that you can use these tools to help you develop your own theological framework for you to use in your ministry in times of disaster. The second thing I'd like to do is give you some practical advice regarding ministry in the disaster setting. It comes from research and years of application in America and here in Australia. Briefly, some of my experiences. I have 21 years in the U.S. Military, and in the military, like the Defense Force here, you train for the worst and then just respond to the local emergencies. In Australia, I worked with the Gap Uniting Church through and did disaster ministry after the Gap storm in 2008. I moved out west to the Maranoa region, and from there, while I was in Roma, we experienced 3 100-year floods in 22 months. In between a couple of those floods, I worked in Goodna during the Brisbane floods, and then when I thought I deserved a holiday, I went to the United States and visited my dad, and he was evacuated for flooding. So you're beginning to think that Linda might be a little bit of a disaster, but just like my tropical cyclone namesake, very short-lived. It was short-lived. But I learned a lot during that time and began to have a passion for what is it that the churches actually do and what should we be doing in the event of a disaster. How can we make our Christian response better? So first, let's start with what actually is a disaster. What's the definition? The American Red Cross defines disaster like this. They say, a situation that causes human suffering or creates human needs that the victim cannot alleviate without assistance. That's a pretty good definition. The Australian emergency management nationally, in Australia, a disaster is defined like this: a serious disruption to community life which threatens death or injury in that community and or damage to property which is beyond the day-to-day capacity of the prescribed statutory authorities and which requires special mobilization and organization of resources other than those normally available to those authorities. A lot more words, but basically the same meaning. Here in the Redlands on your disaster management plan, and you can go online and Google Redlands Disaster Management Plan, and from whatever community you come from, go ahead and look it up. They'll have a definition there. Here in the Redlands, It says this: a serious disruption in community caused by the impact of an event that requires a significant coordinated response by state government and other entities to help the community to recover from that disruption. A serious disruption means loss of human life or illness or injury to humans, widespread or severe property loss or damage, widespread or severe damage to the environment. That is a disaster. And in that time, the basics of disaster ministry are truly simple. First, you have to meet people's human needs: shelter, water, safety, security. Then, if they feel like it, you meet their spiritual needs. The spiritual question that they will ask eventually is, where is God? Where is God? The answer to this question is as complex as it is simple. It's part of the great paradox of life in which we live. God is there with us, incarnate. Simple. But it becomes complex because in the time of disaster, we no longer know how to be sure of that fact. We no longer are sure that God is with us, and our faith is often shaken. We struggle to come to terms with the dissonance that we see and experience and try of understanding a loving God and the visible trauma. In a disaster situation, emotion takes over logic. And that's a topic I'll address in a little bit more detail later on. But the spiritual questions that come up, why, is why? Why me? Why this? Where is God? Now, as Christian responders or people working in disaster ministry, it's not our job to answer that question. That is not your job. And I know that sounds wrong, but hear me out. We are not responsible for answering the question of where is God on behalf of the people to whom we minister. You see, that is part of their own personal spiritual journey, that question they must wrestle with. And they need and deserve to have the respect and time and space to work through that themselves. The work of answering the question of where is God for each and every one of us is our own personal wrestling with God, so to speak. So go ahead and imagine, if you will, that night Jacob wrestled with God. Go ahead and imagine the exhaustion and the hard work. And imagine in the morning that blessing that he received by enduring the challenge of wrestling with God. Jacob was renewed, his name was changed, his life was changed. But now imagine someone interrupting that wrestling with, oh, wait, I've got the answers. Don't do it. Imagine Jacob's wrestling as personal. He had to do the work to change from the trickster to the patriarch. And though he did that work alone, remember he had a community around him, not far away, even a brother who was happy to see him. Our work in disaster ministry is to be with people. You can go to the first slide, Aaron. Thank you. Is to be with people as they explore that spiritual question. We are to hold their hands while they wrestle with God. So if we're going to walk with people on a deep spiritual journey, it's actually pretty important that we have already worked through these questions ourselves, that we have a theological framework with which to respond. Or we can be damaged by the disaster that we see around us, and we can damage other people in our response. So the first thing I'd like to do is to give you some information that might help you do that theological work and develop your own framework. Oh, did you think I was going to give you some answers? No. It's just some information that might help you come to your own landing. Where is God in the natural disaster? First, I recommend that you look at where is God in creation. And as you start your reflection, you might start at Genesis chapter 1. As you reread the chapters of creation, Genesis, those first few chapters, and I do encourage you to reread them. Read them not for the order of events or the timing or the what. Read them carefully for the relationships. During the first 2 days of creation, God does the work. God acts alone. And once there's a bit of order, God doesn't act alone anymore. God says in Genesis 1:11, "Let the earth put forth." And what happens? The earth puts forth. God invited creation to join God in the creation process. There was a relationship. Now, I'm going to warn you, there's some radical ideas here, but could we then say that God gave creation free will? I don't know. God set the earth up to do what the earth should do. Create. And if you imagine the earth creating, what do you get? Volcanoes, natural disasters, maybe. And that was just day 3. God and the earth worked together for creating. Day 4, God creates. Day 5, God says, "Let the waters bring forth." Again, an invitation for God and creation to work together. This time, God created. But there was some sort of relationship involved. The waters had some part. They had some role to play. God didn't do creation by God's self. God then said, "Multiply," giving them the capacity to continue to create. So there's evidence of relationship between God and creation from the beginning. Then you get to that sticky point in Genesis where God says, "Let us." Who is he talking to? However you understand that divine chorus to which God refers, it's inclusive. It's a relational word. And how you define it is probably not so important right now as the fact that you understand that we have a relational God. And God's relationship was with all of creation as well as with humankind. So God spoke to this inclusive divine chorus and said, "Oh, we're going to create humans. They're special, and they're going to have dominion over." And so before human beings were even created, God has told someone else that humans are going to have some dominion. So they're going to have a role to play in part of this relationship. Now, as we think about dominion, you can hear or read that as have power over. Yes, but dominion does not need to be abusive power, particularly when you recognize that you have the power and act in humility. And in disaster work and ministry, it's very important that you remember, as in any pastoral relationship, the people you are working with are vulnerable. You have the power. You have dominion. Don't abuse that. Don't forget it. Don't step into people's wrestling with God and give them the answers. Let them wrestle, and you go with them. I'll talk about power a little bit more later on. But back to creation and relationships. God spoke to the human beings and said, "See, I've given you." All of creation was a gift, wasn't it? Should be respected and cared for as a gift. And the gift was good, but not perfect. It was very good. There is no indication throughout the Genesis, the creation poetry, that this world was without risk. In fact, there are hints that the world was not safe because God specifically creates the monsters and the beasts. God gave these creatures particular behaviors that are not safe for human beings, and there's a notion throughout the whole Old Testament that there are dangerous places, and in the Old Testament it's often called darkness or the deep. But that too was part of this good creation. Now, you might be thinking I've belabored this point about relationships a bit, but it's an important idea to stop and actually consider. It's not just a simple answer that, oh yeah, God created beasts and they're dangerous, and God created the world and it's dangerous, and so we have natural disasters. It's not as simple as that. The relationships are complex. The human beings that God created can impact or even make worse the consequences of natural disaster. There is a relationship between what happens in a disaster with human beings and with God. Where is God? We can further examine the complexity of relationships by jumping to the book of Job. Oh yeah, you should read that book sometime if you're thinking about working in disaster ministry. By all definitions, what happened to Job was a disaster. And if you read through the book, most of the things that happened to him were natural disasters. A few were man-made. But he had fall upon him disaster after disaster. For Job, when it rained, it poured. And that's another important point to remember in disaster ministry. The impact of disasters on people is cumulative. 3 floods in 22 months. The ability to bounce back and be resilient in the Maranoa community was much less the third time around. People just packed up and left the community. And I'll talk a little bit more about resilience later on. So now if you're counting about all the things that I said I'll come back to, we've hit 3. Now, back to Job. Job's friends were not only unhelpful, they didn't help Job in any way. They were simply wrong. And in the end of the book of Job, when God speaks, you learn that there was a freedom to creation that I had alluded to earlier, that free will perhaps, that and so by simply saying that God's in control, we're not only being unhelpful, we're wrong. Job eventually takes his struggle, his wrestling directly to God, as we all must do eventually. And he demands, Job 31, "Let the Almighty answer me." And the wrestling match begins, but this kind of freaks his friend Elihu out. and his friend goes into this little rant. Okay, it's a long rant, chapters 32 to 37, that says, don't take on God. You can't do that. No, that's scary stuff. Somehow we become fearful and threatened when people challenge God's goodness, don't we? But that's part of the nature of wrestling with God, is challenging him. When people take God on, again, we can't answer. They're not taking us on. They're not challenging our faith. They're wrestling with God, and God will answer. And in Job chapter 38, God responds and answers Job out of the whirlwind. God answers out of the storm. Out of that very disaster sort of setting, God answers Job's accusations. This isn't simply the still small voice of God. It's a big one. God points out that Job does not have the capacity to understand the complexity not only of creation but of God and God's relationship with us and creation. God gave boundaries to the sea, but the sea will still behave like the sea, and the sea is dangerous. Concerning the beast Leviathan, who can confront it and be safe? Job chapter 41. Safety was not guaranteed in the creation poetry, nor is it guaranteed in yours or my life today. God set creation going in a manner, and creation can only act in the manner to which God created. But we can make the consequences of natural disasters worse by, for example, poverty, and forcing people to live in unsafe conditions. So we have a role also in natural disasters. It's not a simple answer. So, in my own personal wrestling with God, and I have done quite a bit in my life, I've decided that God is God and I don't understand. But I believe there is an order, that it's not all chaos, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay letting God be God because I have God's promise. You have God's promise. God promised renewal, new life. Over and over again in the Old Testament, people were forgiven and redeemed by God. God demonstrates God's great love for humankind in fact, me, because God demonstrated not only that God was willing to suffer and die, but also be renewed through the resurrection. So I'm personally okay with not understanding the answers to all the questions, because I know that where I am now is not where the end is going to be. Reverend Billy Graham has been quoted a lot recently in the news, and he's quoted, and I'll paraphrase, that when his body dies, that's when he'll be the most alive. And Easter is imminent, and I encourage you to take your personal struggles, and I'm pretty sure you all have them. I'm confident that I'm not alone. Take those struggles into Holy Week. Suffer with the suffering servant and be renewed in the resurrection, because it is then and only then, when you have hope, that you'll be able to enter into disaster recovery ministry. Because disaster ministry, or ministering in the times of disaster, is simply pointing people to hope. That's all. That's all you have to do. You don't have to agree with all my analysis of the Genesis account or Job or the relationships. You have to find your own way and do that work. A couple of resources that I think can help you. A book called Creation Untamed, The Bible, God, and Natural Disasters by Terence Fretheim. He's a Lutheran Old Testament scholar, and he's done a lot of work around a relational God. And suffice it to say, the relationships are complex. Life is unpredictable. But the guarantee that we have, the promise, is new life. Renewal is the word that is used in disaster recovery circles, because rebuilding after a disaster, once you rebuild, it's not the same as before. So renewal is the word that you'll hear in a community after a disaster. And that's what your work is, helping people to understand that there is renewal, there is something new, not like before, but there is that possibility that it will be better and probably even safer. So, Linda, you're asking now, and I know you're thinking, okay, if that's all it is to point to hope, then why did we come here today? I can do that. Because in order to help other people through the complexity of a natural disaster, we have to have worked through it ourselves, and there is no easy answers. And if we have a solid theology and understanding of what God is and who God is and what our relationship is with God, then we are less likely to get caught up in those platitudes and trite responses. And there are so many trite responses to avoid. There are so many phrases that we can say. All you have to do is remember Job's friends. Don't say it. They're not helpful. So if I'm not supposed to enter into somebody else's wrestling match, and I'm supposed to point them to hope, I'm like, really, what can I do? Well, that question is about capability or capacity. What can I do? What do you have the capacity to do? And there are heaps of practical things that you can do in the disaster setting. Heaps of things, but do them according to your gifts and talents. Don't jump in and do things that you're not naturally good at. It's not a time to learn new things. Act in a manner that's renewing. When you do these things, do them with joy. Give hope. Smile. I was told in Goodna, they need to see you smile. So at this point, I'd like to jump back and pick up two of those items that I spoke of earlier, and that is, in a natural disaster situation, emotion takes over the logic. And that second issue that I talked about was power. People who have lost everything, or they think they've lost everything, are vulnerable. In disaster ministry, you have to step back and look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I know most of you will have known that. The first thing people need is physical security. That's your job, to give them hope. You have to help them return, them get back to a place where they're physically safe, perceived or otherwise. You have to help them rebuild their relationships. In an evacuation center, people are separated from families, from children, can be in a different evacuation center. It's stressful. You have to help them reconnect. All that has to happen before they'll ever ask that God question. And if we really are serious about giving hope, that's the needs that we will respond to, people's immediate needs. People are in shock. And they can often get caught dwelling on just one aspect of their situation, and it will be very random. In a house after the flood full of mud, they're going to focus on their grandmother's silver service. I don't know, random. And so you'll talk to them about the silver service, and you'll talk to them, and they'll just keep talking about the silver service. And in the meantime, the mud army will come in and clean everything out of the house. And you might find that silver service, and you'll go wash it up for them so they can have that. And then the mud army leaves, and the house is completely gutted, empty. But because that person was in shock and all they could focus on was the silver service, they suddenly now really have lost everything. Before it was a perception because everything was just covered in mud. Now they've lost everything. Their cutlery, their dishes, everything's on a street being loaded into trucks. So while the mud army had good intentions of cleaning out people's houses and doing it quickly before diseases spread, they also did great harm because they couldn't help people work through their own wrestling with God and that disaster. They didn't work slow enough at that person's level, helping them to come to terms with the loss and helping them refocus and take stock of the things that could have been sanitized and kept. That person only focused on that one aspect because of their loss and shock. And if we remember that we have the power and we humbly walk slowly with them, we can help them wrestle with their new reality and work through those issues. That brings me to the third point that I alluded to earlier. The effect of disasters is cumulative. People who coped with the last disaster might not be able to cope with the second or third. So if you go back into a community a second time, or if it's your community that's suffering from the disaster, they may have walked through it really well the first time, and the second time you cannot assume that they're going to be all right because they did well the time before. And a lot of people get missed in the second disaster, because they had coped so well that first time. You have to go be part of the whole community and check on everyone. Again, their lack of capacity. They've had disaster after disaster. Maybe some of them the disasters haven't been flood or fire. It's been something personal, loss of a family member or pet. But their capacity is diminished. And your job is to point them to hope. What do you have the capacity to do, but do it gently and don't resemble the storm? So what should I do? You're asking me now, Linda. What should I do? Well, what's permissible is a much different question than what do I have the capacity or capability to do. You're in a disaster setting, and you're not the only one to respond. There are bazillions of people who show up after a storm. Bazillions, I'm prone to exaggerate. There are huge numbers of people, and there is a process for working within that disaster space. You have to work with the authorities who are in charge, and you have to submit to the rules of the authorities, even when they don't make sense. At this point, we could go to the next slide because it's very helpful to understand what's actually happening in a community during disaster. A fellow named Scurfield says there's 6 stages of disaster recovery. You have the pre-disaster events, because most of the time we have quite a bit of warning for cyclones or even fire. You have that moment when it impacts, and then this heroic phase when everybody jumps in and you're running on adrenaline and you get things done. And you get a lot of things done, and the community comes together, and then all the responders leave. And you have a very, very sudden drop into disillusionment. And you hit the bottom, and there are trigger events, the next storm or the smell of smoke or whatever it is, and you hang down there pretty low as a community. Now, these are community images for about up to a year, up until that anniversary event. So do something and celebrate and mark that anniversary event. So after 12 years, or after 12 months, then you actually start to see reconstruction. This is a long-tailed animal. 5 years, they estimate the average person to recover from a disaster. And if you're in ministry, most ministers in a disaster setting, unless they have a real strong support network, burn out in 2 years. So another helpful resource for the Australian setting is this book, Ministry in Disaster Settings by Stephen Robinson. And this talks about the actual people, people who are doing ministry, your ministers, your pastors that are on the ground doing ministry, and ways to help them. As faith communities, generally, you're there for the long term. You're in that community that's been affected by a disaster. After that honeymoon, there's almost no need for you to respond until after all the aid agencies and services leave, because you need to rest and regroup for that long haul in that disillusionment and reconstruction phase. The next slide is helpful. The first one is the mood, and that second slide, the bottom, is the need. They're exact opposites. So when we're in that heroic mood and we're working together really well, we need less. But when we get to 6, 8, 9 months out, our needs are much higher because our mood is much lower. I have these as a handout that will go with the talk, so they'll be online. The 6th stage then in reconstruction is actually growth. Scurfield says that most communities come out the other end 5 years on, better and stronger. But 5 years is a long time to work through this. And so as ministry in that disaster setting in a church congregation, you need to prepare for that long haul and plan it out so that you don't burn out and get tired. That's what's happening at a community level. But that being said, there are also lots of do's and don'ts in disaster ministry. Don't speak platitudes and trite little sayings, throw them out. Don't evangelize. You don't need to tell people to repent and turn to God. It's not the time to make disciples. You actually need to just tell them that God loves them And you know God loves you because I'm here. God sent me. Let God then make disciples later on when they have the capacity to or have their lives rebuilt. It takes time. Remember that you hold the power and people are vulnerable. Don't abuse that. Don't operate outside your expertise. Refer. Get referrals. Take them to the GP. Take them to a counselor or whatever it is they need. Now, make sure you have someone that you're accountable to. Don't be a lone ranger. Don't do it alone. Have someone to debrief to, someone taking care of your needs. And the most important thing for a person who's in the disaster ministry space is rest. Step out of that ministry often and listen to God's still, quiet voice in your life. Wrestle with God about the destruction that you see. Cry, because you need a fresh mind and spirit to endure. The relationship between God and creation isn't the only complex relationship. The relationships in community are just as complex. The relationship with the authorities who make the decisions, and the decisions don't often make sense to us. Those whole situations are complex. And I would suggest that you actually should prepare yourselves to be in that disaster space, and that's why I felt it was important for me to come talk to you now. Just a couple of notes on who's in charge in the disaster setting. In Queensland, it's the police. Immediately after any emergency, the police are in charge, and they work very closely with Queensland Fire and local council. Local council then has agreements in place between with other service providers. So the most efficient way for you to help in a disaster setting is to know those complex relationships and work within them. Find out who the service providers are and volunteer. Receive their training. Be endorsed by government agencies. Again, according to your gifts and talents, some examples might be if you're good at hospitality, the Salvation Army is in charge of catering. And you don't have to be a member of the Salvation Army to volunteer to work at their catering van. And you get the training and you get that authority to work in that disaster space, knowing that you're not going to cause harm, that you're part of a team and a community responding. If you've got a truck and are strong and are doing lifting, then you want to work for Give It. And that's an agency that handles the goods and delivery of needs. Chaplaincy in the Redlands and in the other states, I have some of their pamphlets as well. In Victoria and in Tasmania, in Western Australia, they actually have certified and trained chaplains that work with government agencies. We have them in the Redlands, but Queensland doesn't endorse that program statewide. So get trained as a disaster recovery chaplain. And most importantly, don't send stuff. Please don't send stuff. If you have material things to give it through the agency called Give It. I recently heard a story that a school collected a large shipment of tinned fish to send to Tonga after their cyclone. Sounds good. These children in Australia were concerned that the children in Tonga wouldn't have enough to eat. But you know what? The Tongan children know how to fish, and they're surrounded by water. They didn't need, they had plenty of fish to eat. Fresh vegetables maybe would have been more helpful, but no, they had plenty of fish. So the tin fish is sitting there in Tonga, and there's no money to rebuild the school. Don't send stuff. Give money through approved agencies that are doing on the ground, doing the recovery work. Always send money. So if the disaster is not in your area, if it's somewhere else, fundraise. If you have stuff, have a garage sale, give the money to one of the agencies that are working in that disaster space. Because if you want to bring hope, helping people restore their lives as quickly as possible, we'll do that. And that's, again, your task is to bring hope. And now you're thinking this is a complex situation. Giving hope seems like an easy thing, but how can I give hope? Will people really hear the good news when they're lost everything? How do I rise to that challenge? Just being there, and most importantly, prayer. Pray. Because I have witnessed people turn to Christ through the disaster, because people came in and said, I'm here because God loves you and God told me to help you. You see, in our unity, in our loving response, people see a loving God. And it's all people, regardless of race, culture, religion. We are all human beings, and having our basic human needs met is love. That demonstrates God's love. That brings hope and renewal. And God will do the rest. We have a faithful God. The seeds of God's love will be planted, and in the right season, they will come to know the God that is with them. It is complex, but you can be prepared. In fact, I would say you have to be prepared for the disaster setting. For 21 years in the U.S. Air Force, we trained and trained for things that never actually happened. But when things did happen, or when something else happened, we knew what to do. I could just act without even thinking about it. We need to be prepared before the disaster strikes. In your community, I've got Toowoomba's now, I don't have the Redlands. You have a community disaster plan. Look it up. Contact the agencies that are listed. Volunteer. Learn about yourself and your struggle with God. Be comfortable with not knowing all the answers, because you don't need to have all the answers to do ministry in the midst of a disaster. Thank you.